Do you live in Guatemala City, Antigua, Escuintla, or anywhere across Zacatepeques and Chimaltenango? Do you have family in Alotenango, San Pedro Yepocapa, or San Miguel Dueñas? If the answer is yes, or if you simply care about what happens when one of the most dangerous volcanoes on Earth sits just 25 miles from a capital city of nearly 3 million people, you need to watch this entire video, because what has been unfolding at Fuego Volcano is not over, and officials are warning that the explosive phase could still be far from finished. Fuego means fire in Spanish, and right now, that name has never felt more accurate. This is Central America's most active volcano, a 3,763-meter giant standing at 12,346 feet, rising directly over the historic city of Antigua, one of Guatemala's most visited places on the planet. For years, Fuego has rumbled quietly in the background, a slow, steady heartbeat of ash and smoke that locals learned to live beside. But in the first week of August, that heartbeat turned violent, and the world watched as the sky over Guatemala turned a deep, glowing red. It started on August 3rd, when in Sivumer, Guatemala's National Institute of Seismology, Volcanology, Meteorology, and Hydrology issued a series of special bulletins warning that Fuego had entered a new eruptive phase. Within hours, the volcano was producing lava fountains shooting 200 to 300 meters above the crater, roughly 650 to nearly 1,000 feet of molten rock bursting into the night sky. Ash columns climbed as high as 5 to 6 kilometers above sea level, drifting for miles across the countryside. Pyroclastic flows, scorching rivers of gas, ash, and rock that can move faster than a car on a highway, began pouring down the Seca and Ceniza ravines on the volcano's flanks. By August 4th, Guatemala's Disaster Coordination Agency, known as CONRED, had declared the country's second highest emergency alert, an orange danger alert applied nationwide. 3 municipalities were pushed straight to red, the highest level that exists. Officials began evacuating entire communities, and video from that night shows something almost unbelievable. Lava fountains lighting up the darkness, clouds glowing a furious red from the reflected heat below, and thick black ash spewing nearly 4 miles into the atmosphere. But here is the problem. This wasn't just a normal eruption for Fuego. Guatemala's own Institute of Volcanology said publicly that the volcano was, in their words, moving toward a more explosive phase. Think about what that means. This volcano is already one of the most active on the planet, already erupting in some form nearly every single day since 2002. And officials were telling the public that what they were watching was not the peak. It was the beginning of something bigger. Roughly 1,600 to 1,700 people were evacuated in the first wave, forced to leave their homes in the middle of the night with whatever they could carry. Shelters filled up fast. Families who had lived beside this volcano their entire lives, who had learned to sleep through its rumbling, suddenly found themselves staring at a wall of fire in the distance, deciding in minutes whether to run. Roughly 30,000 people across the surrounding departments were told they were in the risk zone, with disaster officials publicly urging residents to self-evacuate if the situation escalated. Because as one CONRED spokesperson put it directly to the public, if your life is at risk, you do not wait for a formal order. You leave. This next part matters, because it explains why this eruption felt so different from Fuego's usual activity. The eruptive episode that began August 3rd lasted nearly 50 straight hours. 50 hours of explosions, of lava fountaining, of ash raining down on towns, of families listening to booming shockwaves rattle their windows and roofs in the middle of the night. Communities on the western and southern flanks were named as the highest risk zones, directly in the path of potential pyroclastic flows and mud flows. A major highway, National Route 14, connecting communities around the volcano, was shut down entirely. Schools across the region suspended classes. And residents in the red alert municipalities were told to cover their water supplies and keep masks ready, because ash contamination was already becoming a health concern. Now here is where the story gets even more serious, because Fuego doesn't just threaten people with lava and ash. Its most dangerous weapon is something most people outside Guatemala have never even heard of: lahars. A lahar is a mudflow made of volcanic ash, rock, and debris, mixed with water, usually from heavy rainfall hitting freshly deposited ash on the volcano's slopes. These flows can move with terrifying speed, and they can bury entire towns without warning. Guatemala's disaster agency has repeatedly said that lahars remain one of the single greatest threats connected to this eruption, especially because August sits directly in the middle of Guatemala's rainy season. That means every heavy downpour over the volcano's upper slopes carries the risk of sending a wall of mud and debris crashing down into the ravines below, the same ravines that run directly toward populated communities. Mudflows, already stretching up to 7 kilometers, more than 4 miles long, were recorded descending from the volcano in the days following the initial eruption, and officials warned that incoming rain could make that worse. And this is where the real story becomes personal, because this is not the first time Fuego has done this. This is where the focus shifts to history and to why so many people in Guatemala reacted with genuine fear the moment this eruption began. On June 3rd, 2018, Fuego erupted with a force that caught even experienced volcanologists off guard. Pyroclastic flows moved down the same drainage systems that officials are watching right now, and they slammed into the village of San Miguel Los Lotes and the community of El Rodeo with almost no warning. Homes were buried under scorching ash and rock in minutes. The official death toll from that disaster stands at 194 confirmed dead, with 234 more listed as missing and presumed dead, numbers that, when combined, mean this single eruption may have killed more than 400 people. Entire families were buried inside their own homes. Survivors described outrunning a cloud of superheated gas and ash that moved faster than anyone could sprint. That disaster remains one of the deadliest volcanic events in Central American history. And it happened on this exact same mountain, using these exact same drainage paths that are active again right now. That is why, when Insavumiech says this volcano is moving toward a more explosive phase, officials in Guatemala do not take that lightly. That is why Conrad moved immediately to red alerts in the highest risk zones instead of waiting to see what would happen. Nobody wants a repeat of 2018. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Even with better monitoring, better alert systems, and faster evacuations than 7 years ago, the terrain has not changed. The ravines are still there. The slopes are still steep. And when Fuego produces enough material at the summit, it can collapse and send pyroclastic material rushing down those same paths in minutes, giving families in the surrounding villages almost no time to react. Most people watching this from outside Guatemala don't realize just how close this volcano sits to a major capital city. Fuego is only about 40 kilometers, roughly 25 miles, from Guatemala City, a metropolitan area home to millions of people. It towers directly over Antigua, a UNESCO World Heritage City and one of the most visited destinations in the entire country, sitting only 16 to 18 kilometers from the crater. Tourists walk the cobblestone streets of Antigua every single day with this active, unpredictable volcano looming in the background. When ash starts falling, it doesn't just affect isolated rural villages. It can reach a city built around tourism, aviation, and daily life for millions of residents. And that brings us to the aviation danger, because this is a part of the story a lot of coverage skipped over. Guatemala's Directorate General of Civil Aviation issued direct warnings to pilots, alerting them that volcanic ash was affecting airspace to the west and west-southwest of the volcano, stretching all the way toward the Mexican border. Volcanic ash is not like normal smoke. It's made of tiny fragments of glass and rock that can be pulled into jet engines and cause them to fail mid-flight. This is one of the most serious risks in modern aviation, and it's why authorities immediately began monitoring flight paths near Guatemala's main international airport, La Aurora, even though the airport itself stayed operational throughout the eruption. Let's slow down for a second and actually explain what a pyroclastic flow is, because this term gets thrown around in headlines without anyone breaking down why it's so uniquely deadly. A pyroclastic flow is not lava creeping slowly across the ground the way you might picture from old documentaries. It is a dense, fast-moving avalanche of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments, capable of reaching temperatures well above 400 degrees Celsius and moving at speeds that can exceed 100 kilometers per hour, faster than most highway traffic. There is no outrunning it on foot. There is no outdriving it if the road is already congested with other evacuating families. The only real defense is distance, early warning, and getting out of its projected path long before it ever forms. That is exactly why officials pushed red alerts into 3 municipalities so quickly after this eruption began, because once accumulated material at the summit starts to collapse, the window to react shrinks from hours down to minutes. And that fear is not theoretical. It is written into the geography of this exact region. The ravines that channel Fuego's pyroclastic flows, the Las Lajas, Honda, El Chute, and Trinidad drainages among them, are the same south and southeast pathways that carried the flow into San Miguel Los Lotes in 2018. These are not new dangers. They are known, mapped, monitored corridors, and yet families continue to live along their edges because for most of the year, most years, Fuego simply smolders quietly, producing nothing more than the kind of small ash puffs and rumbling that locals have learned to treat as background noise. That is the cruel math of living beside one of the most active volcanoes on the planet. The vast majority of days are safe. It's the rare, sudden departure from that pattern that turns deadly, and nobody can predict with certainty exactly which day that will be. One more thing you need to know, because this is the part that should really concern anyone tracking this story closely. As of the most recent bulletins from Insavum, in the second week of August, Fuego had not gone quiet. The massive 50-hour eruptive episode from August 3rd and 4th did ease by August 5th, with officials describing a progressive reduction in intensity. But even as activity calmed, Guatemala's disaster agency issued a warning that should give anyone in the region pause. Accumulated volcanic material sitting at the summit was still collapsing, which meant new pyroclastic flows could still be generated, even without a fresh, large-scale explosion. In other words, the mountain didn't need to erupt again to remain dangerous. It just needed gravity. And now it gets worse because the volcano never actually returned to silence. By August 8th and 9th, Nzivume was reporting continued eruptive activity, weaker than the initial explosive phase, but persistent. By August 11th and 12th, monitoring stations were recording explosions occurring at a rate of up to 10 per hour, sending ash and gas plumes rising more than 1,000 meters above the vent on the strongest pulses. Incandescent rockfalls continued tumbling down the slopes. Residents in nearby communities reported hearing audible booms and rumbling, along with shock waves strong enough to vibrate the roofs and windows of their homes night after night. This is not a volcano that erupted once and went back to sleep. This is a volcano that has been actively, continuously venting for more than 2 weeks straight, with no clear signal from officials that the danger has fully passed. This is where it becomes dangerous for the people who live in the shadow of this mountain, because normalization is one of the biggest risks in any long-running volcanic crisis. When an eruption drags on for weeks instead of days, communities start to relax. Families who evacuated in the first wave start drifting back toward their homes. Farmers go back to check on crops buried under ash, trying to salvage what they can before the growing season is lost completely. Shop owners reopen. Children go back to school once classes resume. And all the while, the volcano is still active, still producing incandescent material, still capable of collapsing that accumulated summit debris into a fast-moving pyroclastic flow with very little warning. Officials have been blunt about this exact danger, admitting publicly that Guatemala's disaster laws are not coercive, meaning authorities can strongly urge residents to leave, but they cannot force anyone out of a red alert zone. That single fact means thousands of people are making a personal daily gamble about whether it's safe to stay close to a volcano that experts have already said is trending toward greater explosivity. Think about what daily life actually looks like right now for a family in Alotenango or San Pedro Yapacapa. You go to sleep at night, not knowing if a shock wave from an explosion 2 miles away is going to rattle your windows before sunrise. You keep a mask by the door in case ash starts falling while you're outside. You watch the sky during every rainstorm, because you know that rain hitting the ash-covered slopes above your town could trigger a lahar, barreling down the same ravine that runs behind your house. Farmers who depend on this land are watching crops get buried under layers of gray ash, wiping out income for the season, in a region where agriculture is often the only livelihood available. This is not an abstract weather story playing out somewhere far away. This is real families making real decisions about survival, night after night, for more than 2 weeks now. But that is not the full story either, because this eruption is also being watched closely by scientists who study something bigger than just this one eruption. Fuego sits directly along the Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped zone stretching around the Pacific Ocean that is home to roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes, and around 75% of all active and dormant volcanoes on the planet. Guatemala itself sits at the collision point of the Cocos and Caribbean tectonic plates, one of the most seismically and volcanically active regions on Earth. Fuego is not alone here either. It sits alongside Pacaya and Santiaguito, two other continuously monitored active volcanoes in the same small country, meaning Guatemala is essentially forced to track multiple active eruption threats simultaneously using a single national monitoring agency and a single disaster response system stretched across all of them. There's also a health dimension to this crisis that rarely makes the headlines, but matters enormously to the people actually breathing this air every day. Volcanic ash is not the same as the soft, harmless ash from a wood fire. It is made up of microscopic shards of pulverized rock and volcanic glass, sharp enough at a microscopic level to irritate lungs, eyes, and skin. For children, the elderly, and anyone with asthma or existing respiratory conditions, prolonged exposure to ashfall can trigger serious breathing problems, which is exactly why Conrad's own spokesperson publicly told residents in the highest risk municipalities to keep masks on hand and cover their water storage containers, since falling ash can contaminate open water supplies that many rural households in Guatemala still rely on for drinking, cooking, and washing. Multiply that across tens of thousands of people living inside the affected zone, and you start to understand why this eruption is not just a geological event. It is a public health event playing out in real time, with impacts that could linger for weeks after the ash itself finally stops falling. Now the focus shifts to what officials are actually watching for next, because this is the part that determines whether the situation stabilizes or escalates further. Volcanologists monitoring Fuego are tracking a specific combination of signals: the rate of explosions per hour, the height of the ash and gas plumes above the vent, the presence and frequency of incandescent rockfalls, and most critically, the volume of material accumulating at the summit that could collapse without warning. When all of those numbers rise together, that is historically when Fuego has produced its most dangerous pyroclastic events, including the type of collapse that devastated San Miguel Los Lotes in 2018. Right now, multiple of those indicators, explosion frequency, plume height, and incandescent activity, have all remained elevated well past the point where officials expected this eruptive episode to fully calm down. What happened next changed how seriously international observers are treating this story. Major global outlets, from CNN to Al Jazeera to CBS News, all picked up direct coverage of the eruption within hours of it beginning, an unusually fast and widespread response for a volcanic event outside a major population center. Guatemala's own government leaned into public transparency, releasing footage in real time, holding press conferences, and directly quoting officials describing the volcano's activity as being in a, quote, critical explosive phase. That kind of language, used publicly by a national disaster agency, is not chosen lightly. It's meant to communicate genuine elevated risk to a population that has lived beside this mountain for generations, and knows exactly what those words can mean. One more thing you need to know before we get to where things stand right now. The evacuation shelters that filled up in the first days of August are still, as of the most recent reporting, housing displaced families. Roughly 1,700 people remained in shelters in the days following the initial eruption, uncertain when or if it would be safe to return home. For some of those families, this is not their first evacuation. Fuego forced an eruption-driven displacement of around 1,200 people back in 2023 alone, meaning some of these same households have now been forced from their homes multiple times in just the past few years. That is the reality of living in the shadow of Central America's most active volcano. It is not a single crisis. It is a recurring one, and every time it happens, families have to decide all over again whether to rebuild in place or walk away from land that has belonged to their family for generations. Here is why this is serious right now, today, as we bring you this update. INCIVUME's most recent bulletins confirm that Fuego is still actively erupting. Explosions are still being recorded at a pace of up to 10 per hour. Ash and gas plumes are still rising over 1,000 meters above the vent on the stronger pulses. Incandescent rockfalls are still tumbling down the slopes, visible at night from surrounding towns. And officials still have not lifted the elevated alert status across the highest risk municipalities. The volcano that many hoped would return to its normal, lower intensity pattern after the initial 50-hour episode has instead settled into a prolonged, unpredictable rhythm, one that experts say could either taper off gradually or could spike again into another major explosive phase with very little advance warning. This is exactly the pattern that concerns volcanologists the most, because history shows that Fuego doesn't always give a clean signal before its most dangerous moments. The 2018 disaster followed a period of what many considered typical, manageable activity, before a sudden catastrophic pyroclastic flow event changed everything in a matter of minutes. That is the core fear driving Conrad's continued caution today. It's not necessarily that the current level of activity is unmanageable on its own. It's that Fuego has proven, in living memory, that it can escalate from persistent but survivable into catastrophic, with almost no warning window for the people living closest to it. This next part matters too, because Fuego's story cannot be separated from the wider pattern of volcanic unrest playing out across the Ring of Fire this year. From Indonesia to the Philippines to the volcanic belts of Central America, monitoring agencies around the world have been tracking an unusually active stretch of eruptive behavior across multiple high-risk volcanoes simultaneously. That does not mean these eruptions are directly connected in a geological sense. Volcanoes on opposite sides of the Pacific do not trigger one another. But it does mean that global disaster response networks, satellite monitoring systems, and aviation safety authorities are being stretched across an unusually high number of active crises at the same time, which makes coordinated international support harder to mobilize quickly if any single eruption suddenly escalates beyond what local agencies can manage alone. For a country like Guatemala, a nation with limited emergency response resources, compared to wealthier nations, that global backdrop matters, because it shapes how much outside help could realistically arrive, and how fast, if Fuego's activity were to spike into something bigger than what INCIVUME and Conrad can handle with their own personnel and equipment. So where does that leave the millions of people connected to this region right now? Guatemala City remains untouched directly by ashfall in most reports, but sits close enough that any major shift in wind direction or explosive intensity could change that quickly. Antigua, with its enormous daily flow of tourists and residents, sits at a distance considered relatively safe under current conditions, but remains within range of ashfall depending on eruption strength and wind patterns. And the communities closest to the volcano, Alotenango, San Pedro Yepocapa, San Miguel Dueñas, and the villages scattered across the Zacatepeques, Escuintla, and Chimaltenango departments, remain the front line, living day-to-day under an alert system that officials themselves admit cannot force anyone to leave, only strongly recommend it. And tonight, as Ncivume continues issuing updated bulletins, and Conrad continues monitoring rainfall patterns for the lahar risk that experts say could remain elevated for weeks after any major ashfall event, the situation on this mountain remains fluid. Fuego has been erupting in some continuous form since 2002, longer than some viewers watching this video have been alive. And this latest explosive phase is simply the newest, most intense chapter in a story that has never fully ended. What began as a routine day of monitoring on August 3rd turned into a 50-hour explosive episode that forced thousands from their homes. And more than 2 weeks later, the volcano is still venting, still producing incandescent rockfalls, and still sending shockwaves through the homes of families who have nowhere else to go. Think back to Isaac Garcia, a resident of El Porvenir on the slopes of the volcano, who made the decision to evacuate his family early in the crisis, with the memory of 2018 still fresh in his mind. Stories like his are playing out across dozens of communities right now, ordinary people weighing the sound of a distant rumble against the safety of the only home they've ever known, deciding in real time whether tonight is the night to leave. Multiply that single decision across the tens of thousands of residents inside the current risk zone, and you begin to understand the scale of what this eruption has actually forced onto this region, not just an environmental disaster, but a rolling ongoing test of thousands of individual judgment calls made under pressure, night after night, with imperfect information and a volcano that refuses to give a clear, final answer. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes tonight, and every night this eruption continues, so difficult to predict. Seismic stations around Fuego are recording tremor data around the clock. Satellite systems are tracking thermal anomalies in the crater in near real time. Washington's Volcanic Ash Advisory Center continues issuing updated bulletins on ash plume movement for pilots flying anywhere near Central American airspace. And on the ground, disaster response teams are stationed and ready to move the moment conditions change. But even with every one of those systems running simultaneously, volcanology remains, at its core, a science of probability, not certainty. Experts can tell you what Fuego has done in the past, what its current seismic signature suggests about pressure building beneath the surface, and which drainage paths carry the highest statistical risk if a major collapse occurs. What they cannot tell you is the exact hour, or the exact day, when the next major escalation might happen, if it happens at all. That gap between what science can measure and what science can predict is the space where every family near this volcano is currently living. It's the space where a farmer decides whether it's finally safe enough to go check on his fields. It's the space where a mother decides whether her children can sleep at home tonight or need another night in a shelter cot. It's the space where a shop owner in Alotenango decides whether reopening the store is worth the risk of being caught mid-explosion with no time to reach higher ground. Multiply that decision by tens of thousands of households, night after night, for more than 2 weeks running. And you start to understand the exhausting, grinding reality of living through a prolonged volcanic crisis, one that never quite reaches a clean resolution and never quite lets its neighbors fully exhale. The next rainfall over Fuego's ash-covered slopes could trigger another lahar racing down toward populated ravines. The next collapse of accumulated summit material could send a new pyroclastic flow down paths that have already proven in 2018 exactly how deadly they can be. And the next explosive pulse could either be another manageable event in a long, exhausting eruption, or it could be the one that forces officials to make the same impossible decisions they faced years ago on this same mountain. Right now, nobody, not Ncivume, not Conrad, not the volcanologists watching every seismic reading in real time, can say for certain which of those outcomes is coming next. What they can say, and what they have said publicly again and again, is that this volcano is not finished, the risk has not passed, and the communities living in its shadow need to stay ready for whatever comes next. Fuego has been erupting in some form for over 2 decades, but this current phase has already reminded an entire region why this mountain has earned its name, and why nobody watching it closely is willing to say, with any real confidence, that the worst has already happened.